December 7, 1941, 07:53 hours. Battleship Row, Ford Island, Pearl Harbor. Seaman second-class David Russell, 19 years old, sipped his lukewarm coffee on the fantail of the USS Arizona. The Hawaiian Sunday morning was perfect, a postcard of tropical paradise, warm, humid, with a high cloudless sky. Below decks, most of his shipmates were still asleep. Russell was on the early watch, a mundane, peaceful duty. In the breast pocket of his white jumper, a letter from his older brother Frank was a tactile link to another world. Frank was a line foreman at the Ford River Rouge plant in Dearborn, Michigan. His last letter had been a complaint, griping about a new government contract that was forcing them to retool part of the line. "They want us to build engines for airplanes," Frank had written, annoyed. "What a waste of time," Russell smiled, folding the letter. He looked past the USS Vestal moored alongside at the sky. A low, unfamiliar drone was growing, coming from the north. Not the familiar growl of the P-40s from Wheeler Field. This was a swarm. He squinted. A line of planes diving. He saw the red meatball insignia on the wings. He felt a sudden, cold, intellectual confusion. Why are our planes painted like that? Then the world ended. The first torpedo, dropped by a Kate torpedo bomber, slammed into the USS Oklahoma just yards away. An instant later, a bomb hit the Arizona's deck far forward. Russell was thrown against a bulkhead as the ship's alarm, a frantic, useless gong gong gong, began to clang. He heard a sound he would never forget. A high, whistling shriek. He looked up. A single plane diving. He saw the bomb drop, tumbling end over end. It disappeared near the forward turret. The explosion was not a sound. It was an event. A 1,160-pound armor-piercing shell, modified into a bomb, had punched through the deck and detonated the forward powder magazine. A 1 million-pound column of fire, smoke, and steel erupted 500 feet into the air. The Arizona leaped from the water, broke in half, and began to sink, taking 1,177 of his shipmates with it. David Russell, blown into the burning, oil-slicked water, looked back at the smoking ruin of the United States Pacific Fleet. Japan had just kicked the door in. He had no way of knowing that the answer to this inferno would not come from another battleship. It would come from his brother's factory and 1,000 others just like it. The inferno at Pearl Harbor was not a random act of aggression. It was a calculated, desperate, and terrifyingly logical gamble. Japan in 1941 was a modern industrial power with a fatal flaw. It had no natural resources. It was an empire built on imported oil, imported steel, and imported rubber. The United States, in response to Japan's brutal war in China, had just imposed a crippling oil embargo. The Japanese war machine, starved of fuel, was grinding to a halt. For the Imperial High Command in Tokyo, the choice was stark: a humiliating retreat from China, or a war of conquest to seize the oil-rich Dutch East Indies and the rubber plantations of Malaya. They chose war, but one colossal obstacle stood in their way: the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Their entire naval doctrine was built around a single concept: Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. It was a strategy born from their legendary 1905 victory at Tsushima, where they had annihilated the Russian fleet. The Japanese believed they could not win a long, protracted war of industrial attrition against the United States. Their only hope was to strike a single, devastating, knockout blow. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was a brilliant, tragic figure. He had studied at Harvard. He had been a naval attaché in Washington. He knew the industrial power of America. He famously, though perhaps apocryphally, warned his government, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." His plan was to use his Kido Butai, the most powerful carrier strike force in the world, to sink the American battleships, destroy the carriers, and cripple the fleet. This, he believed, would buy Japan the 6 to 12 months it needed to conquer its southern resource area and build a fortified defensive perimeter. The assumption was that the soft, decadent Americans, faced with a fait accompli and a two-ocean war, would have no stomach for a long, bloody fight and would sue for a negotiated peace. It was the single greatest strategic miscalculation of the 20th century. The answer to Pearl Harbor did not begin in a recruiting office. It began on the factory floor, December 8, 1941, Packard Motor Car Company, Detroit, Michigan. Ed Blevins, a 42-year-old line foreman, stood on the catwalk overlooking his assembly line. The noise was a familiar rhythmic symphony of metal stamping and hissing hydraulics. Below him, The long, polished chassis of the 1942 Packard Clipper sedan, the pinnacle of American luxury, rolled slowly forward. It was a world of chrome, lacquer, and white wall tires. Then, the plant manager hit the main power switch. The line ground to a halt. The sudden, deafening silence was terrifying. The manager, a man Ed had only ever seen in a suit, stood on a wooden crate, a copy of the Detroit Free Press in his hand. His voice was shaking. "Men," he said, "I don't know how to tell you this. The Japanese, they bombed Pearl Harbor. We are at war." A wave of confusion, then a low animal growl of anger rolled across the factory floor. Ed, a veteran of the Great War's trenches, felt a cold, familiar dread. But the manager wasn't finished. As of right now," he stammered, reading from a telegram, "all civilian automotive production is suspended, by order of the president." He looked up, his eyes meeting Ed's. "We're not building Clippers anymore, boys. We're retooling. We're going to build aircraft engines, Rolls-Royce Merlins, for the P-51 Mustang." Ed Blevins looked at the half-finished luxury car, a symbol of a world that had just died. He looked at his men, their faces a mix of fear and rage. The sleeping giant that Yamamoto had feared was not the U.S. Navy. It was this. It was Ed Blevins and his line, a factory that could pivot from making a symbol of decadent capitalism to making the heart of a war-winning fighter plane in the span of a single afternoon. The arsenal of democracy was being born, not with a bugle call, but with the flip of a power switch. The Japanese High Command's gamble was built on a foundation of profound ideological contempt. Their worldview was a feudal, samurai code, Bushido, that elevated spirit, Yamato Damashi, above all else. To them, dying for the emperor was the ultimate glorious honor. They looked at America and saw a degenerate nation, a mongrel race, corrupted by individualism, jazz music, and a soft consumer lifestyle. They were a nation of shopkeepers, obsessed with money and comfort. Their military intelligence, while tactically brilliant, was strategically blind. They saw a nation divided by isolationism, still reeling from the Great Depression. They saw the chaos of American democracy, the labor strikes, the loud, argumentative press. They simply could not conceive that this chaotic, individualistic, luxury-obsessed society could unify itself into a disciplined, single-minded war machine. They believed that when their decisive battle sank the fleet, the American will would break. They expected a population, terrified of losses, to demand that President Roosevelt negotiate. How could a nation that builds Packards, their thinking went, have the stomach for a war of total bloody attrition? They mistook America's capacity for consumerism as a weakness, not realizing it was just the peacetime setting of the most terrifying industrial capitalist engine the world had ever built. They had not just attacked a fleet, they had insulted a factory, and the factory was about to answer. The action that won the war was not a single battle. It was a relentless, 24/7, 4-year-long industrial blitzkrieg. The moment Hitler declared war on the U.S. on December 11th, he sealed his fate, pitting his state-controlled handwork, craftsmanship, economy against an engine that had mastered one thing: mass production. The Battle of the Shipyard. In 1941, it took 244 days to build a Liberty ship, the 10,000-ton cargo vessel that was the lifeline to Britain and Russia. This was too slow. Industrialist Henry J. Kaiser, a man who had built dams, not ships, applied his process. He didn't build a ship, he assembled it. In 28 yards, teams prefabricated massive 250-ton sections, which were then welded together, not riveted at the slipway. By 1943, the average build time was 42 days. On November 12, 1942, as a demonstration, the SS Robert E. Peary was launched 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after its keel was laid. Japan, with its high-craft artisan shipyards, could not even comprehend this. The Battle of the Sky, Ford's Willow Run plant. Charles Sorensen, Ford's production genius, had made an impossible promise: 1 B-24 Liberator heavy bomber per hour. The aviation world laughed. A bomber was a complex handcrafted machine, but Sorensen built a mile-long dual assembly line, the largest factory under one roof in the world. After a disastrous first year, the Will It Run joke would hit its stride. By 1944, a 30-ton, 4-engine heavy bomber with 1.2 million parts was rolling off the line every 63 minutes. The Battle of the Ground. The Detroit auto industry was the Arsenal Chrysler. At its Detroit tank arsenal, It was producing M4 Sherman tanks on an automotive-style assembly line. By 1944, one Sherman was rolling out every 30 minutes. Packard, Ed Blevins' factory, which once made luxury cars, produced 55,000 Merlin engines, powering the P-51 Mustang. General Motors produced 13,000 aircraft, 2.5 million trucks, 200,000 cannons. The list was endless. The action was this. A German panzer factory at its peak could build 140 Tiger tanks in a month. The U.S. was building 4,000 Shermans in a month. The math was no longer war. It was annihilation. The most stunning outcome of this mobilization was not just the sheer volume, but the scope. The production numbers were so high that the German and Japanese leadership literally did not believe them. When Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, was shown the 1943 U.S. production figures, he presented them to Hitler, who promptly dismissed them as fantastic, childish propaganda. Hitler could not conceive of a nation that could produce 80,000 aircraft in a single year, 1943, when his own, strained factories were struggling to produce 15,000. The truth was the propaganda, but the answer was not just for America. It was for the world. This was the true unexpected power of the arsenal. Through the Lend-Lease Act, the U.S. became the factory for the entire Allied cause, a concept the Axis had no equivalent for. To Great Britain, the U.S. sent over 30,000 tanks, 80,000 aircraft, and hundreds of ships. To the Soviet Union, the U.S. sent over 400,000 Studebaker and Jeep trucks, the vehicles that allowed the Red Army to conduct its deep, mobile blitzkrieg operations all the way to Berlin. It sent 14,000 aircraft, 7,000 tanks, and 1.75 million tons of food. The United States was not just fighting a two-front war. It was supplying a five-front war, the Eastern Front, the Western Front, the Pacific, China, and the Atlantic, simultaneously. Japan had attacked one fleet in one ocean. America had answered by building 10 fleets for all oceans, and arming every one of its friends at the same time. The psychological impact of this material avalanche on the frontline Axis soldier was the most effective weapon of all. It was the moment tactical victory became strategic despair. For the German panzer ace, it was a war of soul-crushing futility. He and his magnificent 60-ton Tiger could knock out 10, 15, 20 Allied tanks. But as he looked over the next hill, there were not 20, but 200 more M4 Shermans, an endless green tide of them. His victories were tactically brilliant, but strategically meaningless. For the Japanese pilot, it was the Grumman Ironworks. The U.S. Navy's F-6F Hellcat was not a delicate, peerless fighter like his Mitsubishi Zero. It was, as one Japanese ace put it, a brick, but a brick that was everywhere. The Japanese had trained an elite, irreplaceable corps of samurai pilots. The U.S. was mass-producing 2,000 new pilots a month, and giving them a plane that was good enough, incredibly tough, and available in limitless numbers. The elite Japanese aces were not outfought. They were swarmed. They were drowned in a river of steel and rivets. This was the answer to Pearl Harbor. It was the realization, in a bunker in Berlin or a pillbox on Iwo Jima, that you were not fighting an army. You were fighting a factory, and the factory was winning. The war was won not by a single wonder weapon, but by the mundane, unstoppable, overwhelming production line. Japan's attack on the fleet at Pearl Harbor was a catastrophic success. It succeeded in its mission perfectly, and in doing so, it guaranteed the total, unconditional, and systemic annihilation of the Japanese Empire. Yamamoto's 6-month clock was deadly accurate. In June 1942, almost exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy, with its carriers intact, they had been at sea on Deck 7th, ambushed and destroyed the Japanese Kido Butai at the Battle of Midway. Japan's offensive capability was broken. From that moment on, the war became one of industrial attrition. The exact war Japan knew it could never win. The arsenal of democracy did not just win the war. It defined the peace. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the United States was the only major industrial power on Earth that was not a smoking ruin. Its factories, perfected by the demands of war, simply retooled again. The assembly lines that built B-24s began building the cars, refrigerators, and televisions that fueled the post-war boom. The answer to Pearl Harbor was not just victory. It was the creation of a new world, a Pax Americana, built not on treaties or armies, but on the unassailable, undeniable, and terrifying power of the American factory.